What caused the war? Start with the causes. There is a third way between the stylized contrast with which I began. This view acknowledges that NATO expansion poisoned the well for U.S.-Russia relations, and that Russia understandably saw it, well before Putin came on the scene, indeed, as far back as the early 1990s, as recently declassified documents demonstrate, as a hostile move, even a threatening one, which Russian leaders also regarded as unnecessary. Expanding a Cold War alliance to Russia's border was not the best nor the only way to build a post-Cold War security architecture in Europe, a case I made at length in these pages last March. The third view of the war, however, introduces a critical caveat. On February 24th last year, there was no chance that Ukraine would enter NATO anytime soon, if ever. Hence, there was no existential threat facing Russia, as Putin and those sympathetic to the invasion aver. At the April 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO did open its doors to Ukraine, stating in the conclave's closing declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. But 14 years later, the alliance had not even provided Kyiv with a membership action plan, a step essential to moving its candidacy forward. NATO apparently could not muster the unanimity needed to admit Ukraine, and may never have been able to. It's reasonable to assume that Putin understood this. Although NATO has been widely praised for its fulsome support of Ukraine since the outbreak of the war, in the years leading up to it, the alliance put Ukraine in a vulnerable position. By announcing its commitment to admit Ukraine, it raised the temperature between Kyiv and Moscow, but then failed to follow through and offer protection. In consequence, Ukraine lacked the means to deter Russia's invasion, and could not count on other states to rush to its defense once it occurred. In this third view, although NATO expansion did create the context for the invasion, it did not cause it. It was hardly the case that Putin was left with no choice but to invade a sovereign country, one that posed no clear and present threat to Russia, no less. Suggesting otherwise strips Putin of agency, which, as he has proved time and again, he surely does not lack. Nor is it convincing to contend that Ukraine had become a de facto member of the alliance well before the war, a claim that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did make 6 months following the invasion, and that defense minister, ending the war. Realists and progressives boil their explanation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine down to NATO expansion, and then add warnings about escalation. However, they have rarely spoken about the course of action the United States should have taken after the invasion. While they oppose the Biden administration's arming of Ukraine, they fail to specify what, if anything, they would have done instead once Putin attacked and occupied large swaths of the country. This, in effect, suggests that Russia should have been allowed to conquer, or at least partition, Ukraine. It amounts to punishing the Ukrainian people for the original sin of NATO expansion, a plan that was hatched in Washington. Russia's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity seems not to matter either, even though Russia, along with the United States and United Kingdom, signed the December 1994 Budapest Memorandum. The signatories to that agreement formally recognized Ukraine's sovereignty within its then existing borders and undertook not to violate them. More specifically, they pledged to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine. But apparently this commitment seems of little account, or it was vitiated by the West's decision to expand NATO, never mind the memorandum's categorical, unconditional language. Before the war, some critics of Biden's policy toward Ukraine favored transforming it into a neutral state. Though that was certainly an opportunity that the United States and its NATO allies missed, from the Ukrainian standpoint, neutrality would not have really been that in reality. Given that Russia was both vastly more powerful and adjacent to Ukraine, neutrality would effectively have consigned Ukrainians to its sphere of influence, with the degree of domination by Moscow remaining as the sole uncertainty. Kyiv would have had to accept in act of faith that Russia would prove to be a benign hegemon. Moreover, what worked for neutral Finland, which also shares a long border with Russia, during the Cold War would not have worked for Ukraine. Russia has never viewed Finland, which maintained its non-bloc status during the Cold War, the way it views Ukraine, even though Finland was part of the Russian Empire, though as an autonomous Grand Duchy from 1809-1917. In Putin's reading of history, and that of the many Russian nationalists who support his war, Ukraine has been connected to Russia for centuries by history, language, culture, and faith, a point Putin hammered home in a 7,000-word essay written in July 2021 entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In the narrative of Russian arch-nationalists, therefore, Ukraine is really not a separate country. This is not a new perspective, nor one that Putin has adopted recently. At the Bucharest summit, for instance, Putin, according to the Russian newspaper Kommersant, told George W. Bush that Ukraine is not even a state. What is Ukraine? A part of its territory is Eastern Europe. Another part, Ukraine east of the Dnipro River, and a significant one, is a donation from us.